I hope the church realizes what a blessing that is. To have community like that, to have union like that. Again, a lot of churches would do anything to have this amount of people meeting together and this amount of people that love each other enough to get out of their seat, walk across the building, shake hands with somebody, hug somebody. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and we need to be grateful for that. I haven't preached here in over a year, so y'all have got a really long sermon coming your way. About 54 weeks I've been preparing this one or so you got a long one. We'll be done in about 3.5 hours. Get you out after the lunch rush, and you won't have to worry about, waiting on anybody, so you're welcome in advance. I'm just kidding. I promise you I'm not a long-winded preacher. It'd be funny if this time I did speak for a long time. It'd be pretty ironic. I spent a lot of time over the past couple of weeks reflecting a lot on my ministry. Just finished up year 13, and what I found really interesting during my reflection is focusing on moments where I felt like God moved the most, not because of me, just during my 13 years of just living life in general. And I feel like as Christians, oftentimes we really wait for these huge, gigantic breakthrough moments. Like those are the moments we live for. I was talking to Ricky in the lobby before I walked in, and we were talking about Sloan and how beautiful it is to see somebody get saved. Right? Like that's the greatest blessing, and it rejuvenates the soul. It's exciting for that family. It's exciting for that church. It's exciting for that one individual. Like those are huge breakthrough, monumental moments, and they're really amazing, and we need to be grateful for them. And there are moments where people have had a relationship with God, and then they've turned from God and been away from him for a really long time, and they come back to Christ again. It's like that's a huge breakthrough, monumental moment. But what I found when I was reflecting and thinking about the memories that stuck out to me the most, it wasn't always just the huge breakthrough, monumental moments that resonated in my mind. Oftentimes, God moves in the everyday in-between. The moments that almost feel insignificant, that's when God can be utilized the most. Now, do we need to do everything that we can to see lost souls saved? Absolutely. Do we live to see those breakthrough moments? For sure. But if all we're doing as Christians is waiting to be on this mountaintop for this big breakthrough moment, and then this mountaintop for this breakthrough moment, we miss all the everyday in between. And much of the Christian life is lived in between the everyday. I go to work, I come home, I spend time with my family. Just that, I don't want to say mundane, like complacent. It's just routine, right? And there's so many opportunities in the everyday in between to see monumental breakthrough moments. If you're somebody that likes sermons, or titles for sermons, the title of this is What Seems Insignificant. And what seems insignificant to you and what seems insignificant to me may not be insignificant in the eyes of the Lord. We, comparatively speaking, in comparison to God, are insignificant. I mean, in his eyes, we have value, but comparatively speaking, we're nothing. The means that we have to really point people to Jesus sometimes can feel insignificant. We don't feel like we have the right words. We don't feel like our testimony is strong enough. We don't feel like our walk is strong enough. It feels insignificant. So what seems insignificant to you can sometimes discourage us and keep us down. And I really hope today that you will leave encouraged. I'm going to give you a challenge. I'm a teacher, for those of you guys that don't know, and one of the things that they always have us do is they give an objective at the beginning of your lesson, and then you revisit that objective throughout. And we're going to kind of do that today. So my objective and what I hope that you take away from this sermon is that when you leave here, I'm going to challenge you to find one insignificant moment throughout this week. Not throughout the month, not 5 insignificant moments, not 2, just one. One insignificant moment this week, and allow God to move through it. And just see what he can do. Put him to the test and watch God work, because he can do some absolutely extraordinary things in insignificant moments that you think he's not even paying attention to, because he's always there. He's ever present. He's ever moving. He's standing there, knocking on the door, just waiting for you to invite him in. He's a gentleman. He's not going to force his way into the room. But if you open the door in those insignificant moments and give him the opportunity to speak through you, I guarantee you he will do things that you do not even dream imaginable. I promise you. Try it. Just test it out. So if you have your Bibles and you want to turn, we're going to read from Mark chapter 6. We'll jump a few different places, but we're going to start with Mark chapter 6 in the 37th verse. If you've ever heard me preach before, you know I like to do a lot of paraphrasing, and I'm not somebody that just assumes that everybody in the room understands a story, even if it's a familiar one, like what we're going to go over today. If you've been in church your whole life, you're right, you're probably relatively familiar. But we may have a visitor in here that this is their first time ever encountering Jesus, and I'm not just going to run through. So if you give me just a couple of minutes, I really want to set the scene and help everybody understand exactly what's going on in this moment. So Mark chapter 6 is really interesting because quite a few things happen up till this moment where Jesus feeds 5,000 people. At the beginning of the chapter, Jesus returns to Nazareth, and he's basically rejected. That's his hometown. Following that, he ends up sending his disciples out, and they're working, and I'll read it because I don't want to misparaphrase this part because I think that it's important. And it says in the 7th verse, and Tommy doesn't have this up here, but I'll just read it real quick. It says, "And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you and they will not listen to you when you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So the disciples have gone out and they're working and they're trying to point lost souls to Jesus, and they're casting out demons, and they're doing all of this in Jesus' name. And what happens, and you'll realize this, when you start to move and you start to allow God to work through you, it's not you doing the work. And I want to make that very, very clear. A lot of times people put a lot of stock into who's standing up here on stage. Whether it's myself, whether it's Brother Jeremy, whether it's any pastor, it's not us that you need to be focused on. It's Jesus. And it's the same thing when you go out into your workplaces, when you go out into your schools, when you talk with your family, when you talk with your spouse, your friends, whoever it might be. It's not about you. Okay, and that may hurt your feelings, but it just is what it is. It's about Jesus. And when you allow Jesus to move through you, what you will realize is that people will take notice of what's happening. And that's what's happening here in this story. So the disciples go out into the surrounding towns and villages surrounding Nazareth, and they're telling people about Jesus. And people are hearing from a far distance, and they're paying attention. So what ends up happening, it talks about John the Baptist's death and him being beheaded. That's not where I want to focus here. But what ends up happening after that is that people start looking for Jesus. They're searching him out. And the disciples return from their long journey, their long voyage, their work. They return to Jesus, and he can see that they're tired. He can see that they're exhausted. I mean, if you go back to what it said, they basically left with nothing. And it was a really challenging journey, I would imagine. I mean, most of us, we have vehicles, and we drive from place to place. So just walking from one location, from one town to the next would be exhausting in itself. I think we can all attest to that. So Jesus gives them the opportunity to rest. But as they're coming to Jesus, people see them, and they meet them exactly where they're going to be. So people are excited. They see the disciples. They've heard all these great things. They find out where Jesus is going to be, and a flock of people run to where they're going to be. And that's kind of where we pick up. So I want you to imagine what 5,000 people would look like, okay? And I want you to imagine just how much food you would have to feed 5,000 people. That's a lot, okay? A lot of food. So the disciples, they're exhausted, they're worn out, and they're looking at all these people that have come to hear something from Jesus. Jesus begins to tell them, teach them, shower down his wisdom upon them, if you will. And the disciples realize these people are probably hungry. It's been a long journey for them too. We need to feed them. This is where we pick up. And I don't know, there's just so many things. Sometimes when you read the Bible, you just read it at face value. Sometimes you read it and you just skim over something, or you've heard a story 1,000 times because you've been in church your entire life, and you're like, oh, it's cool, 5,000 people. But if you've never heard this story before, we're not talking about feeding 5,000 people with a lot of food. We're basically talking about feeding 5,000 people with nothing, which is kind of what I feel like I walk around with day to day to offer God. I have nothing to offer him. I feel incredibly insignificant. I feel like the smallest of the small, for sure. So I feel insignificant. I feel like 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish is more than what I carry around. But watch what Jesus has the ability to do when he steps on the scene. Okay, so we're going to pick up in the 37th verse. 5,000 people surrounding the disciples and Jesus here. So the disciples ask him, what do you want us to do with the food? What do you want us to do with these people? And he says, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth, which in your Bible, which is probably the King James, it says 200 penny worth. But it says, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? So let's put that into context. A denarius is about 1 day's worth of earnings. So if you went out and you worked a day, you earned a denarii. So in just our day-to-day context, they're talking about 200 days worth of work is what it would have taken to go into the countryside, go into a village, buy food, bring it back. It would take 200 days worth to feed all of these people. That was their estimation, at least. It says, and he said to them, Jesus speaking here, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. I find it interesting sometimes when Jesus asks questions that I know he already knows the answers to. Like, he knows all things, right? He knew there wasn't going to be much there. So I imagine he's just sitting there and he asked him, and this is just my interpretation, probably not exactly how it happened, but I can imagine Jesus is like, how much food do we have? And the disciples are like, all right, Jesus, we'll go check. And they turn around and Jesus is just sitting there just watching, just waiting, because you know that the disciples get there and they're like, man, we don't have a whole lot. Like, do you want to tell Jesus we only got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish? Do you want to tell him? Like, I wouldn't be the one that would want to communicate that news to him. But he knew all things, and he knew what he had the power to do with something that felt so insignificant to the disciples was more than enough for Jesus. He can take something that feels like nothing and turn it into something that feels extraordinary. It says, and when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. I think it's important to take note that he blessed it. Oftentimes we can step out and try to do things on our own, and if God's blessing isn't a part of it, you're not going to see a whole lot of good things happen. I think it's important to wait for God to tell us to move, but sometimes I think that we're waiting for too big of a God to say, you know, like, hey, you got this huge, like, I'm going to give you this huge impression every single second. It's not always that way, but if you step out on your own, you got to be careful there. So when God's blessing is upon something, that's when you see magnificent, monumental breakthrough moments happen. So it says, in taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Okay, I can't even fathom that. I promise you, if you were there, if we had somebody that walked through these doors and fed everybody in this church, and it wasn't just enough for them to eat, it was enough to fulfill their starving stomach. If that happened, you would leave here and you would spend the rest of your life telling people. That would be like your biggest story, like most monumental thing that happened was like, okay, so let me tell you about this time I was at church. Somebody walked in. You're never going to believe this. They brought 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they satisfied everybody's hunger. You would lose your mind. That would be crazy to think about. Am I wrong there? It's absolutely incredible that Jesus had the ability to feed those 5,000 people. And what happens is there's a lot of symbolism here, because Jesus was not put on earth to satisfy our humanistic desires. He's not here to satisfy our humanistic desire for food so that we're not hungry anymore. He's here for our spiritual hunger. And the situation that we're looking at here is you've got 5,000 people that are hungry for something that only Jesus can provide. That's why they went out of their way to figure out where he was. They heard all the things that were happening from the disciples, and they were hungry. They said, we want some of that. And Jesus is showing them, like, this is what I can do for you. I can fulfill much more than just your physical hunger. I can fill your spiritual hunger even more so. That's my purpose. And what I want you to understand is this. It felt like it wasn't enough to the disciples. You know that they went back to Jesus and they're like, we don't have enough. There's no way that we're going to be able to feed all these people. And I want to encourage you today, okay? If you've got an opportunity in your day-to-day life the everyday in between, the mundane routine of what it is that you're doing, whether you're at work, whether you're at school, whether you're a stay-at-home parent, somewhere in between, whatever it is. If there's an opportunity for you to move and work and tell somebody about Jesus, take advantage of it. When I first got called into ministry, I was 16 years old, and I was right before my junior year of high school, and I felt almost embarrassed a little bit when I would go to school. And I'm ashamed to say that, I'm just being transparent with you. I felt a little bit embarrassed because I knew if people knew that I was in ministry now, they were going to have questions, and I didn't really know if I had answers for them, and I knew I definitely didn't have the right words because there were people that were a lot more qualified to do this job than myself. So I basically spent 2 years hiding out, not telling anybody about Jesus because I felt too insignificant. I was like, God can't use me. I need you to understand that there's purpose for you and God can use you. And if you're just sitting around waiting for the amazing speakers, the people with all the talents to be the ones that move and do things, you're wasting opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. So often we want to get to the next chapter of our life. Like when you're a kid, it's like, man, I can't wait till I'm like 16 years old so I can drive a car, and we waste the younger years of our life. And then we get to 16 and it's like, man, I can't wait till I'm 18 years old and I can move out of my parents' house and I can make all my own decisions and do whatever I want to. And then it's like, okay, I can't wait till I'm out of college and I have a career, I make my own money, I can pay for whatever I want to. And then we get into work and we're like, oh, I'm at a job that I don't really like a whole lot and I'm not making as much money as I want to, so I need a promotion or I need to look for another job. And what we have to understand is that God places us in specific seasons for reasons. There's purpose there, and you have got to do your job of figuring out what is your insignificant purpose that God can use you for to impact somebody's life. You may be the only person for their entire existence that can tell them about Jesus. That's on you. And you're like, nah, God will give them somebody else. He did. He gave them you. You're a living, breathing, walking testimony, and as insignificant as you feel, whether you feel like you're worth 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, or you feel even less than that, if Jesus can do that with so little, what do you think he can do through your willingness to serve him? And I'm not telling you it's going to be easy. Like, I'm not, because that's a lie. There's going to be some people that are going to challenge you. There are going to be days where you step out on faith and you probably fall flat on your face. But God's grace is sufficient for the day he will pick you back up and he will carry you further than what you can carry yourself. If you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul here is writing to the church at Corinth. And in the 12th chapter, he's writing a lot about himself. And he's talking about an affliction. And it doesn't necessarily specify what that affliction is, this thorn in his side that's really, he references him as a messenger from Satan that's really caused him a lot of turmoil, a lot of challenge in his life. And we all have those things. Like, you may not want to talk about them. You may have skeletons that you'd rather keep in your closet and not bring out. But if we're real honest this morning about it, we all have things that we're insecure about. We all have moments in our life that we would rather not allow the rest of the church to know. So we all have moments and seasons where we feel like we're not enough. And we all have moments and seasons where we have hardships that we have to overcome. But I need you to know that you don't have to overcome them by yourself. Paul writes here in the 12th chapter, 2 Corinthians, verse 9, it says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and all calamities. For when I am weak, then and only then I am made strong." Yeah, you may feel insignificant, but that's the point. You may feel weak, but that's the point. What God can do through your weakness is it forces you to lean on him more than you do on yourself. See, we live in a culture, in a society that's very intrinsically motivated, as in you can do it all on your own. You don't need to listen to other people. Be whatever you want to be. pursue whatever you want to pursue. You make it happen on your own. But the Christian walk is much different than that. It's realizing that we have to die to ourselves. We have to lay ourselves down continually in prayer, laying ourselves down at the cross, falling on our hands and our knees and our faces and denying the flesh and allowing God's grace to be sufficient for the day. Who cares what car you drive? Who cares how much money you have in the bank? Who cares how big your house is? For all intents and purposes, like, you need to understand that at some point, this world will be no more. And what we do with our time here is vitally important, because you have to understand that people's souls are on the line. Somebody, if you're saved here, loved you enough to step out of their comfort zone, whether it was a preacher that stood on stage. I guarantee you they weren't very comfortable. Whether it was a mom or a dad, whether it was a friend, whether it was a coworker, somebody stepped out of their comfort zone and allowed God to move through them, because somebody had to tell you about the Bible. Somebody had to tell you the story of Jesus. You didn't figure that out on your own. It was communicated to you. And Jesus resonated with your soul so deeply that you felt conviction. You realized that something was wrong. And if you've been saved, you made an altar somewhere, whether it was at church, whether it was at home, whether it was at a church camp during the summer, whether it was at a youth revival, like whatever it was, God made a way for you to meet him for the very first time. And when you met him for the very first time and you obtained heartfelt, real, true salvation, that moment is going to carry you for all of eternity. And you've got to understand that our job doesn't end with getting saved. That's just the beginning. It's the very, very small. I mean, it's a huge part of it. But God did not just put us here just to get saved. He put us here so we would have free will, that we would choose him. And then from choosing him, we would continually choose him every single day for the rest of our lives. And we would point lost people to Jesus. Not because they deserve it, because they don't. You don't deserve it. I certainly don't deserve it. None of us do. But that's the point. We're all insignificant, but what seems insignificant to you isn't insignificant in the eyes of God. Take advantage of the time you have, because I promise you, you will look back on your life and regret moments that you allowed to slide by. Guarantee it. I wasted so many opportunities. And I'm so tired of seeing, I'm going to share this story, and I don't know why God's telling me to, but sometimes you just got to do what he says do. I really struggle in my workplace. I'm a teacher. I said that earlier. I struggle sometimes to tell people about Jesus. I don't mind telling them about Jesus if they come up to me and ask questions. I'll sit down and have a conversation with you as long as you want to. I'll answer any question that you have. But I struggle to open doors of conversations with people, because sometimes it can feel awkward. Sometimes it can feel a bit unnatural. And I don't want to make them feel like I'm some like crazy, I don't know, Jesus person. But in reality, like I am. I love Jesus with everything that I am. And I need to be proud of that. So I'm ashamed of that part of my walk. But I had an opportunity with a friend of mine that I worked with. And I used to go and talk with her after school. And we would just talk about life in general. And for whatever reason, God opened doors and opportunities for me to talk to her about God. And through our conversations, I really felt like she had an experience where God saved her soul. And you're like, Dillon, that's a great story. Why are you sharing it now? Well, if I wouldn't have done that, I probably would have spent the rest of my life regretting not, because she ended up passing away at the drop of a hat. Left school on a Friday. Wanted to go and say bye to her. I typically did that. It's one of my better friends at school. And I was like, I'll see her on Monday. Right? Like, she's probably doing stuff in her classroom. I'm this end of the hallway. I don't want to walk and take a 5-minute walk that way and then not say bye. And I go home and I wake up Saturday morning, get a phone call and say, hey, she passed away. I'm like, don't mess with me, man. I don't have time for jokes. And they're like, no, she died. And it shook me to my core, and still does to this day, for a couple of reasons. One, because I am incredibly grateful that for once in my life, I had the courage to actually sit down and talk to somebody about Jesus. And I know in my heart where she's at today. You have people that you come in contact with every single day. And so frequently, we take for granted time. It's like, oh, I'll talk to him next week. I'll talk to him tomorrow. And as cliche as as the saying goes, it's like, you're not guaranteed tomorrow. You're not guaranteed your next breath. And I'm not somebody that tries to like scare somebody into salvation. That's not really my thing. I'd much rather just tell you about the love of Jesus and allow that to convict your soul. But I need you to understand, I'm not even talking to lost people. I'm really talking to saved people here. People's souls are on the line, and they're not guaranteed. I'm not talking about your breath. I'm talking about their breath. They're not guaranteed their next breath. And I believe when time is no more and my life is over and I stand before God on Judgment Day, I believe that I'm going to have to be held accountable for the people that God put me in their life for a reason, and I didn't do what I was supposed to. And I believe you're going to be held accountable. And I hope, I'm almost 30 years old now, I hope I spent a lot more time in my 30s than I did in my 20s pointing people to Jesus, because this world needs a lot more of him than it does of it's being provided right now. And again, it's not easy, but look at the life that Jesus lived. Was that easy? Like, he's the example, right? He's what, that is what being a Christian is. It's attempting to do our best to be Christ-like. And you don't have to do it on your own. And some of you guys may feel it's like, well, Dillon, I don't always feel Jesus in my everyday life. Sometimes life is just, it's so hectic, and I don't take time to pray. I don't have time to open my Bible. I need you to know you have a support group here of people. You've got a family. You've got a community, a body of baptized believers that have been saved that will get down on their hands and knees, and they'll pray with you, and they'll walk through life with you. Like, church was designed for the broken. We like to put on our nice fancy suits and dresses and make it seem like everybody's perfect and we all got it together. But in reality, we're all broken people in need of a Savior. And we're all broken people that are in need of healing. And we're all broken people that are in need of community. So you may feel insignificant. You may feel broken. You may feel like there's nobody less than you. There's nothing wrong with that. God can still use you. And his grace will be more than sufficient for today. And it'll be more than sufficient for tomorrow and for as long as he allows you to live. Because it's up to him. It's not up to you. We try to do everything we can to stretch our lives out, and we want to live as long as we possibly can. And all that's fine and great, and I think health is important. But at the end of the day, it's all up to him. He's creator. He's Alpha. He's Omega. He's the beginning. He's the end. He controls all things. He breathes breath into your nostrils, into your lungs. What are you going to do with that time? Take advantage of it. Don't lay your head down on your pillow at night and say, wasted another day. Lay your head down on your pillow saying, you know what? I may not have got it all right, but I know I gave it my best shot today. I'll try to do a little bit better tomorrow. I know I'm still going to be insignificant tomorrow. I'm still probably not going to feel even like 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, but maybe, just maybe, God will help me to grow just a little bit. So my challenge to you guys was to leave church this week and find one opportunity. One, whether it's with a friend that's known you your whole life. They're the hardest ones to talk to, in my opinion. Maybe family. They know you pretty well, too. It's easier to talk to strangers, right? They don't know all your mistakes. They haven't seen all your baggage. But it's important for people to see your growth as well. I think that's a beautiful thing. You know, if you knew me in high school versus me now, I'm not saying I have it all together, but I'm making a lot better decisions right now at 29 than I was at 16. And I've had the same friends the entire time, and I guarantee you, if you ask them, they'll tell you, he's making some better choices. So it's okay if you feel like you're an imperfect person. If you're waiting till you have it all together to start telling people about Jesus, you're going to be waiting forever. You ain't ever going to have it all together. That's why Jesus came, a perfect, living sacrifice, so that you and anybody that believes could obtain salvation. So if you're a high school kid and you're going out every Sunday, no, not every Sunday, every Saturday, hopefully it's Sunday you're at church, Fridays, Saturdays, and you're making some real messed up choices, I would encourage you. Surround yourself with better people. And the people that you are going out and you're making bad decisions with, whether you're going out, you're partying, you're drinking, doing drugs, having inappropriate relationships, like whatever it is, I encourage you, while you're in high school, Make the choices that would honor and glorify God. And you're like, Dillon, that is the cheesiest thing I've ever heard. Like, I'm not going into my high school and telling people that I'm living my life to honor and glorify God. Why not? Why? Because you're embarrassed of what they're going to think? You know what's going to happen? They're going to realize whose side you're on. They're going to take note of it. And what happens is when you step out, people will probably say some things that aren't so great. People probably joke on you, give you a hard time. But what you'll realize is that there will be people around that will sit back quietly and not say anything at all. And then they'll come up to you privately and want to ask questions and have a conversation with you. And you're like, oh my gosh, I never knew that God could move this way. So if you're a high school kid or a high school young adult, take advantage of the opportunity that you have. If you're in college, same thing. If you're in your 20s, 30s, don't waste those years of opportunity, because what I've learned is that my friendships, I don't have as much time with my friends as I used to, because you get older and life gets busier, right? You have kids, and that's a whole different ballgame and a whole different conversation, a whole different sermon in itself. But like you have families and you have all these different obligations, and it's like, man, I don't have the same opportunities to talk to my friends about Jesus like I did when I was 22. And then you get older, and life just gets busier and busier. Everybody following my train of thought here? So take advantage of the time that you have now. As insignificant as you feel, God needs you to work. He needs you to move. McFerrin needs you. My prayer for this church is that it will be around when Jesus returns. I mean, whether it's here or we outgrow this space and we have to move to a new location. I think McFerrin is a beautiful light to this community, but I think that we could do more. I don't think this is the end result. I think God's got really, really beautiful plans ahead. But it's going to take his children seeking after his will more than we seek after our own. I want to end with saying this, and then I'll close. If you look at the end of what Paul was saying there to the church at Corinth, he's saying there's going to be afflictions, there's going to be hardships, there's going to be really challenging times. God's grace is sufficient for the day. I listen to a podcast from time to time, and the guy that leads the podcast made a really beautiful point. At least to me, it was beautiful. Hopefully it'll connect with you as well. He said, God's people have got to stop falling in love with God's flowers and start falling in love with his roots. Because if you fall in love with God's flowers, what are you going to do when winter comes? I'm going to say it again. God's people, his children, the ones that have been saved, have got to do a better job of not just falling in love with God's flowers, but falling in love with his roots. Because if you just fall in love with his flowers, what are you going to do when winter comes? When hardships, when trials, calamities of all different sorts, when those things hit you, if all you're holding on to are just the nice, pretty blessings, it's not all mountaintops. Sometimes you're in valleys. Don't fall in love with just the flowers. Fall in love with his roots. His roots are where the grace lies. And only his grace can suffice you. Only his grace can fill the void. Only his grace can get you through the everyday in between. Amen. Find one opportunity this week. One. Family member, friend, coworker, stranger. One opportunity to leave and allow God to move through you and watch him work. You'll be amazed at just how much he can do through a moment that seems so insignificant. We're going to have a song. If you're lost and you don't know Jesus, it's a beautiful opportunity for you to come up here and pray. Remember when I was a kid and I would see people go down to the altar, I was like, man, that's got to be embarrassing. It's got to feel awkward a little bit. Everybody's going to be watching you. This is the thing I learned about this church. You don't have to worry about everybody watching you walk down to the aisle, because by the time you get here, you're going to be surrounded by a bunch of people that are walking down too, that are ready to meet you down there and pray as long as you want to pray. I mean, it's 11:15, but I guarantee you if you wanted to pray till 11:15 tonight, there would still be people here. So if you need healing from your brokenness, here's an altar. Make an altar back there. It doesn't matter to me. If you're somebody that's saved and you're going through a season of struggle, here's an altar for you. Lay down your brokenness at the cross and allow God to heal you. Can't find healing in this world. You can try it if you want to. It's not going to happen. If you feel like you need to join this church, the doors are open. Hear your testimony. You're coming from another church, we can do a credit of a letter. If you need to be baptized, we can do that too. So allow God to move during the next few moments. Let's not sit on the Spirit and let's see what he has. I know a lot of times we're like, oh, we'll sing a song, we'll go home. Maybe not. I know we're in a season of revival, but revival doesn't just have to happen on the days that we set aside. Revival can happen on any ordinary Sunday. Let's see what God has in store.